The aim of this presentation is to describe the process for integrating climate change into the various planning processes at a provincial, regional, and at local levels. This diagram illustrates the basic flow of climate change integration into different planning processes. The first step is to conduct a climate change vulnerability assessment. The process for conducting a climate change vulnerability assessment is covered in a previous training module. In summary though, a climate change vulnerability assessment is an analysis and identification process of your key areas of vulnerability to climate change. Once you have identified priority climate change risks, you then develop a climate change response plan. The process for developing a climate change response plan is also covered in a previous training module. What you aim to achieve with the response plan is a list of climate change adaptation responses that will address your key climate change risks. These two steps, the vulnerability assessment and the climate change response plan, need to be completed before you consider integrating climate change into planning processes, as they form the basis of the information that needs to be highlighted in various plans. Once you have your climate change response plan in place, you can then include key climate change responses into sector plans, spatial development frameworks and plans, rural development plans, and land reform plans. Once climate change is clearly reflected in these plans, you can then ensure that integration of climate change issues are reflected in your Integrated Development Plan, or IDP. Spatial plans and IDPs are obviously closely related, and what is most likely to happen is that once your IDP is revised to include climate change issues will become part of the IDP revision process going forward, and these revisions will then be fed back into the associated spatial plans. So the broad process is firstly to complete a climate change vulnerability assessment, secondly develop a response plan, and thereafter ensure that the key climate change issues are reflected in your spatial plans and from there integrated into the IDP. The implementation and revision of the climate change response plan then becomes a part of the IDP revision process. To integrate climate change into your sector plans, you first need to review the various responses that have been identified in the climate change response plan, and then identify which of the sectors these responses relate to. This slide shows a list of climate change responses on the left and a list of sectors on the right. The responses have been reviewed and allocated to the sectors that they link with most strongly. Some of the responses in your climate change response strategy may be cross-cutting and not appropriate for inclusion in a specific sector plan, but most of the responses are likely to be related to at least one sector. In some cases, you may find that responses are linked to more than one sector. Once you've reviewed all the responses and identified which sectors, if any, they're related to, you can generate a short list of responses that are relevant to a specific sector plan. You can then ask the person responsible for developing that specific sector plan to incorporate these responses into their sector plan. To integrate climate change into spatial plans, the various responses that have been identified in the climate change response plan need to be reviewed. And you do this by identifying which of these responses have a spatial dimension. This slide shows a list of climate change responses on the left. The responses have been reviewed, and two that have a spatial dimension have been identified. Firstly, identify and protect natural environments to assist in stormwater management, and secondly, identify and prevent development in coastal areas at risk from coastal storms. These areas can be identified on a map within a spatial plan. Many of these responses in your climate response strategy will not have a spatial dimension and may not be appropriate in including in the spatial plans for your community. Once you've reviewed all the responses and identified which have a spatial dimension, if any, generate a short list of responses that are appropriate for inclusion in spatial planning for your community. You can then ask the person responsible for spatial planning to incorporate these responses into their plan. To integrate climate change into rural development and land reform plans, review the various responses that have been identified in the climate change response plan and identify which of these responses have a rural development or land reform dimension. This slide shows a list of climate change responses on the left. Of the responses that have been reviewed, 4 have a rural development and land reform dimension. In our example, this will include identify and protect natural environments that assist in stormwater management, identify the crops that will be more resilient to projected climate changes in the area, educate outdoor workers and farmers on the health risks associated with heat waves, educate communities on water-saving measures to protect against future droughts. Some of the responses in your climate change response strategy will not have a rural development or land reform dimension and may not be appropriate for inclusion in these plans for your community. Once you have reviewed all the responses and identified which have a rural and land development dimension, if any, generate a short list of responses that are appropriate for inclusion in your plan for your community. You can then ask the person responsible for rural development and land reform planning to incorporate these into their plans. As can be seen in this presentation, integrating climate change into planning processes is a simple process, provided that you already have gone through the process of developing a climate change response plan for your community. In the next presentation, we will look more closely at the process for integrating climate change into the integrated development plan of the municipality that your community is located in.